Thought this morning I would do the video that I wanted to do for our new members that kind of talks about what Lutheranism is and where it came from. Since I live in Arkansas, this is a movement within Christianity that's not necessarily as familiar to this area. In fact, it's a transplant Protestant tradition mostly, like secondary or third migration to the area. So I've even been asked things like, is Lutheranism a kind of Mormonism or is it a kind of Baptist? And the answer is no, but I can understand why people don't necessarily have a good context for it. So this is just a very high level view on where Lutheranism came from, and I hope it's helpful. So one place to start is to say that Lutheranism comes out of the Christian tradition, and specifically it's connected to the tradition of Christianity that is in the West. So you have like Roman Catholicism that was a Western part of Christianity. There was a split between East and West around 1000 AD. The East is very much less familiar to most Americans unless you were raised in it, and it's smaller than the Western form of Christianity. Roman Catholicism was like the dominant tradition in Europe at the time of the formation of Lutheranism, and what happened essentially was Lutherans originated because there was a movement at the time of like the Renaissance and the Enlightenment that really wanted to emphasize some things that had gotten lost within Roman Catholicism. One of those being the translation of the faith into the language of the people. So you had all these movements in different parts of Europe, like the Hussites and Wycliffe in England, and then Luther in Germany, who took the scriptures, kind of went back to the sources, Hebrew and Greek, and translated directly into the language of the people instead of reading the Bible in Latin. And then you had a number of other things that kind of influenced these religious traditions at the same time. And one of those was I guess you could say kind of like a call for reform within Roman Catholicism. So rather than trying to get away from the Roman Catholic Church, a lot of these folks were simply saying, like, let's get back to the actual roots of Christianity, the church fathers, scripture, these kind of core things of the Christian faith, rather than allowing the accretions that had come along in the history of Christianity to kind of override some of those core things. So Martin Luther emphasized those, and at first was really just working on reforms within the church. But of course, politics being what they are, there was a lot of pushback against that. Who is this guy, Hebrew professor in some rural part of Germany at an upstart university doing all of this? And so there was a ton of condemnation and pushback against it. Eventually, Luther was brought up before the religious authorities and the political authorities and was told that he needed to recant these positions along with the community that was forming around him. They basically said, no, we're not going to do that. Here's our confessions. We need you to show us that that these confessions are wrong. The Roman Catholic Church wasn't willing to do that, and the net result was eventually the expulsion of that Lutheran movement from Roman Catholicism. And then when that happened, when that kind of finally took place, then it made space for the birth of something that was pretty new within Western Christianity, which was that each region in the parts of Germany where this took place became the religious tradition of that leader, that regional leader. So you had some parts of Germany that were Protestant and some that were Catholic. And you started having this like bifurcation and splitting and diversification of forms of Christianity that kind of proliferated all across Europe. So, although on the one hand, Lutheranism was the start of the Protestant Reformation and Protestantism, in another way, it's slightly different from the Protestant movement because it was both the first and because it wasn't actually a protest movement to leave, but rather a reform movement within that then became ultimately separated because it was forced out. Of course, it gets lumped together with all the Protestants and has always been influenced by being Protestant because and there was a strong form of anti-Catholicism all across Protestantism that's been there historically ever since the beginning and the kind of the founding of the Protestant movement. And so Lutherans have tended to want to be like other Protestants even when we differ from them. Probably the biggest example of that being the kind of the anti-sacramental ways in which Lutheranism drifted over the next few centuries, tending to think of the sacraments as simply symbolic and therefore less essential. And so even though Lutheran theology had always kept a real presence sense of the sacraments, because they were Protestant, they tended to shift in these other directions. So Lutheranism then was established, especially in Northern Europe and in Germany, although not exclusively so. There were parts of Lutheranism that extended very, very early into other parts of the world. Just an example, I used to live in Slovakia, and the Lutheran movement in Slovakia is basically as old as the Reformation itself. There were Augsburg Confession type Lutherans all over the world relatively early, and then when there were these secondary and third mission movements that went across the globe, Lutheranism became strongly established not just in Europe but actually all over the planet. So you have really large Lutheran communities now in the modern day in places like Indonesia and Ethiopia. The largest Lutheran church in the world is in Ethiopia, the Mekane Yesu Church. There's large Lutheran communities all across Africa and Madagascar. There are Lutheran churches in South America and Asia. And so Lutheranism really has become a global movement. In many places, what they don't do is they don't call it Lutheran. Luther himself was somewhat uncomfortable with the religious, with a name that was naming after him. So some churches that are Lutheran actually just call themselves churches of the Augsburg Confession. And it really is the case that you can think about Lutheranism uniquely among the Protestant churches as a confessional movement. Unlike Episcopalianism, which is founded a little bit more around leadership and the like liturgy stuff, the Book of Common Prayer, or other Protestant movements that maybe have other originating events, like, for example, Baptists who see their kind of founding in a different sense of what baptism is and signifies. Lutheranism has always been a confessional movement, and so you can read the confessions of the Lutheran Church, like that are contained in the Book of Concord, and especially the Augsburg Confession, the most important and central one that all Lutheran churches really identify with. And you can see what that church teaches around those things. Now, this becomes complicated in that now even the Augsburg Confession and the confessional documents are ancient texts, or at least very old texts in the same way the Bible is. And so now we're in the 21st century, and you can still kind of wonder, like, to what degree does the Lutheranism of the present day, like, for example, the Lutheranism of the church that I'm a pastor of, or to what degree am I even, as a Lutheran pastor, Lutheran? That's a really important question. But it's not unlike the same question we would ask ourselves about to what degree are Christians Christian, in that we are now practicing a faith 2,000 years after its kind of founding, and so much of the culture has shifted, so much history has happened in between, and we're just very different people than the people that were alive at that time for a variety of reasons. And so what I always say to people is, you can go back and you can look at the Augsburg Confessions and you can get a good sense of what Lutherans taught at that time, but you also have to kind of look at what the churches practice and what they do in order to get a fuller or more robust sense of what Lutheranism is today. There are many Lutheranisms, I guess, would be one way of saying it. And of course, Lutheranism, on the one hand, is split, like many other Protestant groups, between kind of conservative and liberal camps. You can find this not just in Lutheran churches, but like, there's the PCUSA, which is the liberal branch of Presbyterians, and then there's PCA, which is the more conservative branch, and you can find this with almost every denomination you can think of. Lutherans have the same thing, for example, where we have Missouri Synod or Wisconsin Synod, which tend to be a little bit more closed and try to tie more tightly to historic Lutheranism versus the liberal forms of Lutheranism that I'm a part of that have diverged from those conservative groups, especially around the ordination of women, full inclusion of LGBTQ in the leadership of the church, all those kinds of things. So there are all those kinds of developments. So in order to say where Lutheranism came from, you also have to kind of talk about what things have impacted Lutheranism since Martin Luther. And probably the biggest moments there was a solidifying of Lutheranism during the Lutheran Orthodox movement, which is essentially the 100 years after the Reformation. That continued one strong strand of Lutheranism that you might consider dogmatic theology, or continuing the confessional movement, focused on doctrine. And of course, Lutherans have historically always been very interested in the maintenance of doctrine, but Lutherans especially, and now I'm speaking especially of my own tradition, the one that comes out of Europe, Lutherans also were very innovative philosophically and theologically. So I'll just give you some examples of people who were Lutheran to give you a sense of the range of this. Immanuel Kant, Friedrich Schleiermacher, Friedrich Nietzsche, Soren Kierkegaard. Each one of those names that I just named shows you a trajectory or a strand that kind of emerged from Lutheranism, whether that was existentialism or the kind of the question everything movement of Nietzsche, or the really strong shift towards experience and intuition of the ultimate that you have in Schleiermacher, or Kant's reasonableness. All of those are still part of Lutheranism and therefore influence the way Lutherans think and practice today. My own tradition, I would say, I'm strongly influenced by the trajectory that came out of Schleiermacher, and then the counter response to that by Barth in the 20th century that then shaped the thinking of theologians like Dietrich Bonhoeffer and a whole generation of theologians in the 20th century. And there you see like the inter-ecumenical influence within Lutheranism, that somehow Lutheranism could bounce over to and influence Barth and then come back into Lutheranism, Barth not being part of the Reformed tradition, and then you end up with kind of modern day ways of thinking. And of course, Bonhoeffer himself, though a Lutheran theologian, really cut his teeth and became the kind of theologian he was when he came to the United States and was in New York and experienced part of the Harlem Renaissance and worshipped in African American congregations, and then took that kind of social justice, social gospel thinking that was a part of American church life back into the practice and the theology that he led in Germany. So in the present day, Lutherans like myself, even though we read the confessions, we're also very influenced by things like the social gospel tradition, and a lot of liberation theologies, I would say in particular. So black liberation theology, feminist theology, womanist theology, queer theology, all of these kinds of movements that are experience-based out of people's lived experience of practicing Christianity within their identity, those also shape very much where the Lutheranism that we have today is. Okay, the last thing, if you want to know where Lutheranism came from in the United States, the reality is it's all immigrant. All Lutheranism immigrated to the United States, obviously. Although some of the earliest settlers to the United States who were Lutheran were the Scandinavians and Europeans more generally, Lutherans have also moved here from all over the world. And so you can find Lutheran communities from Vietnam, Tanzania, Nigeria, Madagascar, and even more than that. But the history of the development of Lutheranism within the United States was especially shaped by many of those churches were ethnic groups that came over and for a while at least felt somewhat isolated from the more general United States culture. They spoke their own languages in worship, which is why they were called like the Norwegian Lutheran Church in America or the Swedish Lutheran Church in America. And then the history of Lutheranism in the United States is the history of the merger of those different ethnic churches into national church bodies that spoke English. So the ELCA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, is a denomination that was formed from the merger of many of those ethnic groups that then came into larger, like the ALC and the LCA, and eventually, and very recently actually, during my lifetime, formed the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, which is the largest Lutheran denomination in the United States. So that denomination has that history of kind of a sensitivity to ethnic groups coming to the United States, practicing their own religious traditions and navigating that kind of journey, which is why Lutherans in the present day still are very much involved in things like immigration and refugee service, because we have historically always been connected to that immigrant experience and have a real empathy with it. So that's like a really high-level view on Lutheranism. I skipped a ton, but I wanted to try to give like a short enough lecture that you might actually take a stab at watching the whole thing. I'm gonna post a couple links in the chat here for people who are interested in reading more and kind of learning more around this, but I hope you enjoyed the talk, and blessings on this beautiful sunny day to all of you.